couple of weeks ago, I spoke about empathy and empathy as a human emotion and how it relates to our interactions with other people. Getting back to our friends, the Stoics, for tonight, I wanted to take the topic a little bit further into the topic of sympathy, or more correctly, sympatheia. A concept that exists in many ancient philosophies. We can easily trace all the way back to Plato, and something that is very important to Stoicism. Sympatheia, not just empathy for someone in a particular situation, but that connectedness that we have, or supposedly have, with the rest of the human species and with nature itself. What is that? The notion of interconnectedness of people, interconnectedness of people with nature and others in nature, is something that is quite popular today and quite fundamental to many, especially New Age philosophical ideas, but to many philosophical and even spiritual and religious ideas throughout history. Very strong on the notion that the human being is not an isolated being, that the experience of life on earth is not an isolated individual experience, and that it is related to and dependent on the experiences of everyone and everything else. In philosophy, sympathy originally referred to the relationship between the human body and the human soul. And while Plato does refer to what we would call cosmic sympathy and the relatedness between things of the cosmos and the greater universe and things of the material world, it's really the Stoics who did a lot of expanding it into some of what we would understand interconnectedness and sympathy to actually refer to. I mean, the Stoics give that sympathy the broadest possible meaning. The idea of connectedness and what we connected to and who we connected to, the largest possible meaning, because according to the Stoics, the soul pervades everything. It pervades not only ourselves, but soul is a characteristic of the cosmos itself, and it pervades all matter in the cosmos, and therefore everything in that cosmos is in a state of interconnectedness, something which does sound like it makes a lot of sense to the modern mind. The idea of an interconnectedness through spirit permeating matter is something that most modern people can be comfortable with. Not necessarily everyone agrees with that, but it's certainly something that's not alien to the modern mind, and it's something that many people do espouse. The idea of sympathy we tend to have reduced to a feeling sorry for, or similar to empathy, as I was saying a couple of weeks ago, that it's a way of relating to another specific individual or someone in a specific situation. And it's even a little bit anticipated by how the Stoics refer to sympathy, when sympathy, according to them, should leave us to believe that because we are all connected, we should behave differently. And because we are all connected, we should find similarity in another person to ourselves. Our guide and master, one of them, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the emperor of Rome, who gives us a lot of the Stoic philosophy in his meditations, the diary he kept for himself. There in the 6th book he says, meditate often on the interconnectedness and mutual interdependencies of all things in the universe. All things are mutually woven together and therefore have an affinity for each other. For one thing follows after another according to their tension of movement, their sympathetic stirrings, and the unity of all substance. That idea was very fundamental to many things that would follow in our culture, not the least of which, for example, was medicine. And much of traditional medicine in Western culture, and indeed even in other cultures, is predicated on an affinity between things, say between certain plants and the human body, or certain plants and certain conditions. An example of that would be the idea of correspondences, or indeed sympathies, when plants might have looked like a particular part of the body or shared a color with something, perhaps to do with that illness. It's another interesting story that many of the medicines discovered that way indeed do have the properties that our ancestors believed simply from their sympathetic appearance physically or in our lives, or where they grow, or whatever. It's a different study as to how that may be and how did we discover that. But this idea of connectedness, of similarity, of everything in nature reflecting ourselves and we reflecting nature back to itself, is something that is so critical to this idea. Indeed, where do we lie with respect to nature? The concept of sympathy is in fact originally expressed as this relationship that we have with nature itself, and as being part of nature. The philosopher Sextus said that the cosmos is neither all joined together or of all separate parts. He says, as we prove from the sympathies it exhibits. He says, in accordance with the waxings and wanings of the moon, and many sea and land animals wane and wax, and ebb tides and flood tides occur with the waxing and waning of the moon. We now know the gravitational reasons why, but that's that early recognition of this cosmic sympathy between the moon and our oceans. And then he says, and in the same way too, and in accordance with certain risings and settings of the stars, and changes in their course, and changes in the atmosphere, and of all the varieties of change that takes place in the atmosphere, sometimes for the better, and sometimes it brings plague and change. But, he says, it is from these facts that it is obvious that the cosmos is a unified body. For in the cases of bodies formed from joined or separate elements, the parts do not sympathize with one another. Since, say, if all the soldiers in an army have perished except one of them, the one who survives is not seen to suffer at all because of what happened to the others. But in the cases of unified bodies, there exists a certain sympathy, since when the finger is cut, the whole body shares its condition. So then, the cosmos is a unified body, just like the human body. So, an interesting parallel that he draws, and an interesting caution. He doesn't go wholeheartedly and say, oh, absolutely everything is connected, it's all deeply meaningful, as you might expect perhaps a more simple philosophy to state. That's not at all what he's suggesting. He's aware of the fact that it doesn't magically make everything and everyone connected, but he says the unified body of the cosmos is reflected in our unified body, but that does not mean that everything is one and part of the same thing. In Stoic philosophy, the whole cosmos is shown as a living body whose parts are not perfect, and they are not self-sufficient. They are not autonomous. They are all therefore connected to each other, but they are not one and the same as each other, as perhaps Sextus was trying to demonstrate us. And that is something that even old Plato does tell us. So back in our first discussion, I think, of Stoicism, and maybe even before that, I spoke about Plato's Timaeus, where one of the books where he does explain the structure of the cosmos and where it comes from. And he does also talk about the relatedness between things, although he's coming from a slightly different point of view. That's not 100% compatible with this idea, because Plato also has got the idea of a perfect archetypal cosmos that we are the imperfect reflection of here in the material world. The connectedness has got an altogether different connotation and different level to it. Nevertheless, he does refer to how things that are separated over great distances can even affect each other. Like Sextus's example of the moon, like the examples that are given of astrology and other things. Sextus gave the example of the planets. Plato does the same thing himself. Even though our modern understandings of science can show in some cases physical reasons why things are connected, it doesn't change anything at all. Maybe there are physical reasons why things are connected. Certainly in the case of planets, that's not visible to us. In the case of the moon, we know that that was a gravitational force. But the fact remains that to the ancient mind, the simple reason behind all of this is because everything is part of one and the same body. There doesn't have to be a mysterious connecting force. The fact that the one part of the body is affected by something else that happens to that body, which is demonstrable in the human body, is all we really need to know. The mechanism of it is not really what concerned the Stoics. From the Stoic point of view, this isn't like a mystical or magical force. There's nothing mystical and magical about sympatheia itself or about the forces that connect things or anything like that. It's simply that because the cosmos is like a whole living body, it's therefore obvious that everything is connected. And the Stoics are also clear that it is not like it's perfect. They did understand the real world that we lived in. In fact, they're the big ones on accept the imperfections because you can't change them. Don't beat yourself up or beat anyone else up about them either. So they may be, in fact, imperfect, but the fact is that with the help of the other bits, they all rely on each other, they're able to achieve what they're trying to do. We know that about physical bodies. There's a lot that's not perfect about physical bodies, and yet we manage to do what we've got to do, and the functions in the body manage to happen, and some of them are accounting for each other, or depending on each other, or responding to each other, or accommodating. When one doesn't work, something else is kicking in to make up a bit of a difference. The Stoics depict a cosmos that works more or less in a similar kind of way. And what kind of holds it all together is a concept of breath or spirit, soul. There is soul or spirit that permeates the entire cosmos. So, to all intents and purposes, the Stoics conceived of the cosmos as a living entity, as a living being. Some would even say as a form of an animal. Certainly, they understood the cosmos to be divine, and the reason being is because it's permeated by soul. And that is one of the things that connects us to it and to everything else, is that we're all permeated by the same soul. Interesting how we also struggle with the idea of soul, and we also struggle with how do we have this idea of a personal soul and how do we contain that, and yet there is this permeation by soul that seems to know no boundaries. So to the Stoics, the soul permeates the human body. It is not something contained inside the human body. It permeates the human body and makes it alive, conscious, and connected to everything else. It's like a web of connectedness, and every part of the body is connected to each other, and every part of ourselves is connected to the greater world through the permeation by soul. An interesting and simple concept that is really often expressed in spiritual and religious terms as the breath of God, that in breathing life into the world, God or spirit becomes its soul. Interesting. The philosopher Chrysippus says Living virtuously is equivalent to living in accordance with experience of nature. He says our individual natures are parts of the nature of the whole universe. And this is why, in the end, sympatheia can be described as life in accordance with our human nature, and therefore with nature, and therefore with the whole cosmos. A life in which we can refrain from every action forbidden by the law common to all things, says Chrysippus. That is to say, a connectedness that is guided by reason. This is what makes us happy. Understood that way, living in accordance with nature doesn't simply mean being a natural creature, following our impulses, doing what some other creature of nature would do. Something that's very often misunderstood in our ideas of living with nature and being natural and all of that kind of thing. It also doesn't mean just adapting to life and going with the flow because that's nature, dealing with the circumstances which we're in, which we do see many of the creatures of nature doing. What it really means, it means participating in our little role within the totality of the universe. Living in accordance with nature doesn't mean trying to copy it. It means trying to be a part of it in a distinctively human way. And what is that distinctively human way? It's rationality. What makes us different than everything else that we know of in nature is our rational nature. Our rational nature is what gives us the capacity for virtue, for voluntarily doing the right thing, following the common law or the right reason, acting with wisdom and circumspection. These arise out of reason. So the philosophers tell us we mustn't just emulate nature, we must be our part in nature. Sympatheia isn't a blind, everything is the same, everything follows the same laws. The law is harmony, and for us to give our part as human beings is to use our rational nature to do that. The great Roman senator Cicero, who was he was stoically inclined, if not a stoic, is usually depicted as a stoic, says, the human being's first attraction is towards the things that are in accordance with nature. But as soon as he or she has gained an understanding or an intelligence about things and has discerned the order and harmony of any particular conduct or behavior, he then esteems this harmony far more highly than any of the other things for which he originally felt an affection. And by exercise of intelligence and reason, infers the conclusion that in this order resides the main good for human beings. So he's saying, at first we're attracted to nature because it does reflect that harmony back to us. But once we understand that, we then need to seek the harmony. That's a very powerful point by Cicero. Don't just emulate nature, occupy the role that we are supposed to have. In order to develop into a fuller agreement with nature, the basis from which one starts is just a start. There is a rational process that then leads from that impulsive basis into rationality and sociability. So what is interesting about that is that it's not only saying that rationality is integral to our nature, but that sociability and affection and connection with other human beings and association with other human beings are part of our rational nature. That the reason why we learn to be rational is in order to effectively connect with other human beings. In order to fully realize our human nature, we have to develop patience and wisdom out of rationality, because patience and wisdom are what we need in order to deal with other human beings. So, out of harmony becomes the rational nature, and the rational nature is used to allow us to connect with other human beings. So the whole idea of connectedness takes on a whole other level, that not only do we arise out of that and discover that it is harmony that we seek, and then we seek to develop rationale and harmony, but then it is that that takes us back to the connectedness and allows us to experience sympatheia with other human beings. As Marcus says, if we understand that we're all connected and that we all depend on each other, that is going to make us good and help us do good for each other. And it's a very powerful point. It's often said that if we didn't have religion or something like that, we wouldn't be moral creatures. But it's not actually true. As Marcus is pointing out, it's our respect for our fellow human beings because of that sympatheia, because we are connected and interdependent. That's what modifies our behavior. He says things like, revere the gods and look after each other. He says, the universe made rational creatures for the sake of each other, with an eye towards mutual benefit based on true value and never on harm. Human beings, he says, have been made for the sake of one another. Teach them or endure them. And finally, you've been made by nature for the purpose of working with others. If sympatheia is about nature and aligning us with nature, then there's absolutely no doubt that Marcus expresses this point, that the purpose of that is to create more sympatheia with other people. And so that endless loop maybe takes us to the divine perfection of Plato's world, where that sympatheia is about the connectedness of everything that is in an absolutely perfect state. The Stoic philosopher Gregory Sadler says, as living beings, human beings are driven by the same natural impulse for self-preservation as are other non-rational living beings. But our rationality may often be used in the service of that impulse, but that's not its only function. Integral to that rationality, as it develops, is a capacity and a desire for living together harmoniously with other people. Rational human nature involves sociability. Living in accordance with nature involves the cultivation of the virtues, prudence, justice, courage, and temperance, patience, morality. Those are what he's referring to. This is not just a matter of blind or mechanical obedience to the demands imposed on us by nature and the outside world, but rather ways in which we apply our human rationality to ourselves and to others and to the situations in which we live together. So ultimately, it is using our rationality not only as self-preservation, but as our means of connecting with other people. It is our rational nature that has helped us understand that we have to consciously and actively live with nature and express sympatheia. It's not just automatic because we are creatures of nature. And I think in this discussion, that's what the Stoics have been trying to tell us, that there's a point at which we then reach above it. As I said earlier, living according to nature teaches us that nature is about that harmony. That harmony then becomes our interest. By focusing on that harmony, we learn that we must develop our rational nature so that we can live in harmony with other human beings. To give the last word to Marcus, what's bad for the bee is bad for the hive. When one suffers, we all suffer. Well, as the holiday season is upon us, hopefully we will remember that sympatheia, apply our rational, harmony-seeking natures, and remember that we are all in it together. Next week, I'll be back to give you what to expect in the month ahead of January, which is already another year. But when it comes to looking at the year ahead, what's going to happen for you in your star sign, and what's going to happen for South Africa, I'll be back in early January telling you all about that. There are a couple of great repeat shows during December. Make sure though that you watch next week and of course during December to find out the dates for finding out what's ahead in the year for you. But I'll see you next week.